See. Back to House Education, Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. Turning our attention to a follow-up on Act 29 that we passed last year. This is the school safety bill. That would be a good opportunity for us to get an update as to how implementation is proceeding, and just kind of learn a bit more about it, and also what sort of is coming up. And very important to sort of at some point hear from the field how implementation is going from their end. We got a little taste of this yesterday in the BAA, and some additional money that was appropriated or is going to be appropriated in BAA to provide more technical assistance. I assume we'll learn a little bit more about that as well. We'll turn it over to the witness table and introduce yourself and lead on. Thank you.
Fantastic. I warned you we were spending a lot of time together this week. Jill Briggs-Campbell, Agency of Education Director of Operations. I'm joined by Dee Barbic, who I'll introduce yourself.
Thank you, and thank you for having us here today. My name is Dee Barbic, and I'm the Director of the Violence Prevention Task Force. With the broad scope of violence prevention work, I do a lot of focus with school safety.
And we thought we would, Chair Conlon, if it's all right, start off with Dee, read some high-level comments, and then we can dive into the slide deck that we shared in the act.
Great.
Again, thank you for taking the time to have us here today. As you recall, there are several major sections of Act 29 covering options-based response drills and fire drills, access control and visitor management policies, development and maintenance of emergency operations plans, which I will often refer to as EOPs, and training and policy development for school threat assessment teams. Since the passage of Act 29, the Vermont School Safety Center and the Agency of Education have done an incredible amount of work together on the implementation of the Act. This includes continual collaboration with schools and stakeholders during this process. Much progress has been made in the development of policies, reporting, updating the EOP template to include a guidance document and continued training for behavioral threat assessment teams. There's a lot of work still yet ahead. Sunny Erickson of the Vermont School Safety Center and Jill Briggs-Campbell of the Agency of Education have more detail in terms of the boots on the ground work that's been done for the implementation of Act 29.
Thank you. And we are joined today by Sunny Erickson from the Vermont School Safety Center, so I might occasionally kick a question over, and Dan Batesy, the Deputy Commissioner of DPS. I think a question had come up yesterday. What exactly is the Vermont School Safety Center? Interim Secretary Boucher gave sort of a high level response to that. So if there are follow-up questions, we've got the expert in the room to answer that. But in some sense, it's sort of a joint effort, a joint endeavor between DPS and the Agency of Education and the Governor's Office to support, to provide targeted supports to schools around safety and security, and to really have that entity that schools can call on. And so if there are additional questions, Sunny is absolutely here to speak to those. So we provided a fairly lengthy slide deck, and I don't intend to go through it. It was more a reminder of what's in Act 29. It's a somewhat complicated piece of legislation to follow, so I oftentimes have to sort of dive back into it and reorient myself. So, and I don't anticipate having to go through every slide, but I wanted to give that as a reference. The first sort of content slide number 2, I just wanted to remind us a little bit of some of the language that's in Act 29 and sort of that hierarchy of, documents and guidance. So we've got state law, we have policies passed by school boards, or there is also a specific call up for AOE to develop a model policy around behavior threat assessment. Procedures sits under that, a finer grain of detail. And then sitting under that are guidelines and best practices, which are often produced by the state for schools to follow. I also want to remind us that Act 29 is very comprehensive in that it applies to all of our public schools and all of our independent schools, both approved and recognized. So it's far-reaching in its scope in ways that not a lot of our other legislation reaches. And as Dee said, this work is well underway. It is a large body of work. We've never really done school safety in such a comprehensive manner. And we've dedicated some significant state resources. So the Vermont School Safety Center, including Sunny Erickson and Rob Evans, who's a consultant for the state, as well as a good portion of my AOE operations team, which I introduced you to a few weeks ago. So myself, Courtney O'Brien, and we have just hired a safe and healthy schools coordinator who, among other things, will really be dedicated to the implementation of Act 29 and supporting the School Safety Center. So in addition, we obviously have support from leadership at AOE, DPS, and the governor's office, all sort of driving towards this. As I said, the work is underway. I do want to acknowledge that the initial timelines in Act 29 were quite aggressive. I think that was signaled during the legislative session that those might be some challenging deadlines to meet, particularly around the implementation of policies that school boards needed to pass during the summer break. And then lo and behold, right in July, we had the flooding event. So I do also want to identify that the same people who do the work on Act 29 are also Sunny is with Vermont Emergency Management, and I'm the emergency response coordinator, so and director during emergencies. So I think that did create a not unanticipated delay in some of the earliest kind of implementation of the school board policies and some of the guidance. So there was a little bit of mismatch in timeline there. But I would say that since then, we've really gotten our feet under us. We've caught up and we're well underway with the work. So as Dee pointed out, Act 29 is comprehensive. It includes options-based response to violent intruder and fire drills, all hazards emergency operations plan. I also call them EOPs, access control and visitor management policies, and then a really comprehensive section on behavior threat assessments. This work, it also did have a section at the bottom that I won't be addressing today because it's not the work of my team, which is creating a working group on student protections from harassment and discrimination in schools. The earliest timelines for implementation began in July. As I said, that was a challenging timeline, I think, for a lot of folks to meet. And I would say our public school boards did a valiant effort in getting those policies passed. We did need to align them a little bit with the drill guidance that went out, and we worked with VSBA and VSA to sort of redraft the policies and get them totally aligned with Act 29. And then sort of the longer term deadlines here is July 1 of 2025, which is when all schools are supposed to have their BTA teams stood up. So we've got another 18 months or so before kind of those final deadlines. And then I'll also say that from the perspective of the School Safety Center and AOE, this is ongoing work, right? So we have the initial implementation of standing this work up, but this is work that is really programmatic in nature and should be ongoing, all of these different aspects of it. The state of Vermont has responsibilities, specific responsibilities. The Agency of Education needs to, and always in consultation with the School Safety Center, DPS, and Office of Racial Equity, who've been excellent partners in this work. Publish guidance related to emergency drills and best practices, develop model BTA, behavior threat assessment policy and procedures, develop technical resources to support that training. The Vermont School Safety Center is specifically identified with maintaining and updating emergency operations plan template in partnership with AOE and Office of Racial Equity where appropriate, and issue guidance on best practices for behavior threat assessment teams, including best practices in reducing incidents of bias. So that's what's in the law itself. So I think that what I'll do is I'll sort of go section by section, and I'll give just a very brief update on like what we've done and what's to come in 2024. If at any point you want to jump in and ask questions, please feel free. One of the first things that we needed to do was create an assurance process. We, in doing this, it was released in September, And in doing this, we acknowledged that there was going to be a little bit of fluidity around when our public schools, but I would specifically call out our independent schools who have really not necessarily been engaged in this work before. We're going to be able to come into compliance with some of the specific requirements. So that assurance web form covered all of the sections with the specific requirements, including the school board policies around access control and options-based response to violent intruder drills. A section where they identify if they currently have a BTA team and an assurance that they will be in compliance with all reporting requirements. I'll speak to that in a moment. And an assurance that they'll complete their emergency operations plans updates by July 1 of this year. There was the ability for them to identify if they were not currently in compliance, but will be at a future date, and that future date was short-term future date. So we are now in the process of reviewing those assurances, identifying who said, we'll be in compliance by January 15th, and going back through and following up with them. We do also ask them to upload their policies that they passed as well. So that process the assurances were due October 15th. I would say we've been batting cleanup, as we always do when we have web forms and requirements. AOE has received 124 responses, 46 out of 52 of our supervisory unions and districts have responded, and 78 out of 128 independent schools. And you'll hear me kind of repeat this refrain throughout, which is that I think our independent schools are going to be challenged in some of this work. I think a lot of our recognized independent schools are not used to having this kind of interaction necessarily with us. So we're going to be doing a lot of touch points to try to educate them, bring them into compliance. We've already held several webinars. We've got our website up and running. They have resources available. Many of our independents are very much engaging with this process and are really seeking to learn and also identify the challenges that they have. But others, not atypically, we really haven't heard from. So that'll be the work of the next few months is trying to get those touch points.
So
Sure.
assurances were due October 15th.
Yep.
When does touch points and working with and all that turn into compliance enforcement?
Yeah, so I now have my Safe and Healthy Schools coordinator. Her first piece of work is to identify who has not completed the assurance. I would say that we don't have a lot of strong levers in terms of Act 29, in terms of what enforcement looks like. So we will probably use our usual, follow-up, consistent follow-up with the secretary included. And I think that we should probably discuss what does compliance and enforcement look like down the line. If you dive into Act 29, there's really only one section where like a fine is specifically called out. That's around fire drills, and that's a fairly standard issue kind of.
If I were somebody sort of shopping to move to Vermont and looking for a school district or an independent school, is the sort of list of those who have complied with the assurances available?
My plan, this is work upcoming for the data reporting requirements, is to have a public facing dashboard. We also do plan to fold as many of these requirements as fit into the district quality standards. So that will be an annual self-evaluation and public dashboard process. So yes, there is plans for transparency around this, along the lines of a district and school report card around compliance with Act 29 and other kind of school safety and security issues.
I hope that would apply to both independent schools.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's in the act. I think it's sort of a natural fit to say, this is who's in compliance with this. All right. So in the Section 1 emergency drills, I'm going to keep plugging along here. There's two major requirements in terms of what do school boards need to do. And this was a school board facing requirement. So it's each school board that operates a school, an independent school, again, approved and recognized, shall adopt a policy mandating options-based response to violent intruder and fire drills. The Options-based response to violent intruder drills must be age appropriate and trauma informed. There's guidance on this available for schools on the School Safety Center website. They've been availing themselves of it. In addition, they need to follow the additional requirements for fire drills that are issued by the National Fire Prevention Association. This is an annual drill. There's nothing really new in that. And it also requires notification to parents not later than 1 school day before a scheduled drill. And finally, there's a new requirement for schools to report that they've completed these drills. We've created a drill reporting tool. We'll be checking it biannually. So again, this will be something for my new Safe and Healthy Schools coordinator. She gets to do a lot of spreadsheets, identifying who hasn't reported and then following up to ensure that they have. So we will be doing that in January and June of each year to ensure that that is being followed. So again, what are the required actions? On the next slide, I've sort of identified those. The work that we've completed to date, we have, in partnership with VSBA, developed a model policy for school boards. And as I already acknowledged, there was a need to align those because of the implications of a lot of the state staff being pulled away for the July flood response. I think that we have a strong alignment now, and most of our SUs have passed those according to the assurances. We will follow up and make sure that everyone has passed those, and our independent schools are ongoing and coming into compliance with that. We also created the assurances by which we're going to check that, and we've created presentations and tools for independent schools. We've offered them to public schools. Our V's at the time indicated that our public schools had a full plate, and we'll come back around to it later. So we'll absolutely be providing them with an update as soon as they're able to absorb it. In the work plan for 2024, so one thing that we have been hearing, particularly from our independent schools, but I suspect there's some of our smaller public schools are going to be challenged by this. For both the access, I would say this generally for access control, for the options-based drills, and for the all hazards emergency operations plan, we recognize that some of our smaller schools, this is going to be challenging. Particularly, I would call out for our independent schools, because our public schools, of course, can leverage the resources of their central offices. From our independent schools, we've heard from many of them that they very diligently want to meet these requirements, that, some of these schools, it's 3 people, right? And so getting an understanding of how do you provide a trauma-informed, age-appropriate, options-based response to violent intruders in a school of less than 20 kids with 3 staff. How do you develop a comprehensive emergency operations plan, while working with local first responders and emergency management directors is challenging, right? There's a certain level of training and expertise that they're going to need to build. So one thing that we are thinking about doing, in addition to all of our other trainings and supports, is potentially creating kind of a small schools working group to help provide them with some technical support. We do also identify, and I'm sort of organically moving through these slides at this point. We have also identified with the access controls, many of our independent schools lease those spaces or they're shared public spaces. So the access controls requires that all exterior doors be locked during the day. This is challenging operationally. And so our independent schools are trying to identify how they're going to meet that. I would say our public schools, many of them are probably still challenged by this. And the kind of technology that we would all ideally want them to have in place, like external door cameras and keypads so that it's easier to get in and out instead of a lock and key, is expensive. And they do not necessarily have the financial resources to do that. So that's going to be something that we all collectively are going to have to grapple with a bit over the next year or two as they're trying to address this. And to also not lose that sort of unique character of Vermont schools that we all cherish so much, which is that interaction with the community, the indoor-outdoor learning that's so key that, I value in my own children's education. So I'm just calling that out as something that we've heard from. We're going to try to provide that support, but I think collectively, we all need to sort of, chew on that a little bit and how we're going to essentially provide those supports.
Just from this is a better question for the Ledge Council, but if I think about, I can think of a couple of therapeutic schools that are based in leased or rented space.
Yep.
Where they don't control the building and don't have permission to put keypads out and all that. I guess we're gonna need to figure out how to accommodate for that in the law.
Yeah.
At some point.
There is a clause within Act 29 that sort of calls out if there is a specific reason why a building can't have access controls. I would say the intention, I'm gonna speak for you all, apologies, but sort of the intention there was really looking more at things like greenhouses and outbuildings and sheds. But there is the ability within that to have a policy that sort of acknowledges that need for flexibility. We've pointed our schools towards that clause and also encouraged them to continue to work towards access controls as a best practice. So I think we're in a little bit of a limbo period there.
Yeah, I've been involved in like school safety as a guidance counselor and on school safety committees in the towns I used to work in when I was in education. One of the things, and I've told people this a lot, the thing that terrifies me is when schools are used for election sites. When I go into Colchester to vote, I always walk to see if I can just get to the classrooms, and I can. There's no barrier for me to have access to those classrooms. And I've kind of pointed it out to people throughout the years, that not asking everybody for an ID, but just having parents or somebody, that is kind of making sure that no one can just, walk into the classroom. So I'm just putting it out to you because I'm hoping that something can be done maybe before town meeting day.
And I think that this also gets to some of the work of, say, this School Construction Aid Task Force, which is, as we're looking at modernizing our facilities, one of those best practices is to have some sort of vestibule or second layer of control so that if someone did get into the school space, there is that sort of second check.
Yeah.
And that is in Act 29, but the ability of schools to have the infrastructure to comply with that, I think is probably very, very inconsistent.
Yeah.
But I think you're identifying something that folks are keenly aware of on the school safety side of things and is part of that need to modernize schools for a really unfortunate context that we're all living in. Yeah.
I mean, it just might be hiring a few more police officers that day that are just, there to create a barrier between the students and the voting public.
You provided me with an excellent segue on accident there, which is looking at the emergency operations plan. And part of that should be planning for events as well, right? So all hazards emergency operations plan are really that they're all hazards, right? And so that might be anything from a graduation to town meeting day to any kind of event. At the state level, we do this kind of work for major events, really consistently. Sunny could probably speak to that better than I can in Vermont emergency management. But for example, we are all doing statewide planning around the total eclipse happening this spring. So that is the kind of thing that goes into your all hazards planning, which is a requirement in Section 2, thank you, of Act 29. Where this work currently is that School Safety Center, AOE, took a look at the documents that currently existed, and with Dee's support as well, made some major updates to them. So there's a guide and a template. It's really important to us that anything that we put out as tools and resources be useful and implementable by our schools. So that is currently, those drafts are being reviewed and feedback is being provided by superintendents and independent school heads and the Vermont School Crisis Planning Committee, which is about 20 different members. Most of, if not all, I don't know the hard number on that, of our SUs and SDs should already have an emergency operations plan. I have yet to come across one who doesn't. They might be lurking out there. Certainly when we were engaged with them in the July flooding and the December 18th rain events, we discovered that while many of our districts do have emergency operations plans, they are maybe not as robust as we would want them to be. And one thing that's specifically called out in Act 29 is that these plans need to be developed in close partnership with local first responders and emergency management folks. And I will say from my experience in the July flooding, working really, really closely with, say, the 6 to 10 districts that were heavily impacted. And again, school was not in session, right? But our districts that had very close ongoing relationships with their first responders, when we would call them and we would say, do you know where your kids are? They could answer, yes, we know, because the second that this happened, we were in touch with our fire department, our police, the local emergency management directors. And as they were going door to door checking on people, they were reporting back to us, we have 3 kids in this household, they've been displaced. They knew where their kids were and were able to get them supports in a much faster way. Other districts, I would say, it's not that they didn't have emergency operations plans, it's not that they didn't respond, but that coordination between local, like the town entities and local first responders and the school districts was not necessarily as strong as it could have been if they had had an ongoing relationship. So I'm calling that out from recent experience. We've seen the value of those partnerships. So this template and guide should be released within the next few weeks. In addition to that, there's no expectation that folks just know how to do this work, right? And so the School Safety Center has already planned out a series of REMS trainings. And oh my gosh, I know I've got it on the slide, so I'm going to save myself here. It is the Sunny Readiness and Emergency Management Plan for Schools. Yes. All right. A victory. REMS trainings. And really, these are intended to go in partnership, right? So you're sitting down to revise or maybe develop for the first time your emergency operations plan as you are taking these REMS trainings, which are excellent and comprehensive and step-by-step. That work is those trainings are scheduled through spring 2024. You will note that it is the recommendation of the Vermont School Safety Center, Vermont Emergency Management, and AOE that more time be provided for this work. We've seen the value of this work being done well. I'll again point to the fact that I think many of our independent schools are starting from square -1 on this and will need additional support. Many of them don't have necessarily relationships with their local first responders and disaster management. We did see that our independent schools during the July flooding were disconnected in a way. And it was harder they were, out there valiantly doing work. And we had a few who had some fairly serious flood damage, but they didn't have sort of that same kind of connection and support ongoing for their students in their buildings. So, and that tie-in with the state, I think, is really critical in those situations. So we do have a recommendation that this deadline be potentially pushed out to July of 2025, open for consideration and discussion, just to give everyone the opportunity to do this work really, really well. You're laying a really critical foundation for all kinds of things, including things like town meeting days and high school graduations and all the fun things that you also want to plan for. And unforeseen things like, having PCBs and needing to be intense, right? We heard that from Superintendent Haas. How does your emergency management plan include that work? All right, I'm going to keep trucking along if no one has objection. Fantastic. Let's get to the behavior threat assessment. This is, I think, it's the largest part of Act 29. I think it's
slide 18, I think.
Yeah, I think we can jump to slide 18. Thank you. Perfect. So behavior threat assessment teams, they are intended to prevent instances of severe and significant targeted violence against schools and school communities. The goal of behavior threat assessment is to appropriately assess and respond to potential reported threats, emphasis on appropriately assess. It should not contribute to increased school seclusion or unnecessary referrals to law enforcement or student discipline systems. It's not in and of itself a law enforcement activity and shouldn't be understood as such. And BTA needs to be implemented and offered in a way that does not disproportionately impact students from historically marginalized backgrounds, including students with disabilities. You heard the interim secretary speak to this a bit yesterday in terms of this conference that we want to offer. That should be sort of folded into a BTA program. So there's several kind of rolling requirements within Act 29. The immediate work that's been underway is that the AOE was directed to develop a model policy and procedures that then school SUs and SDs, as well as independent schools, are then required to adopt a policy that is as comprehensive as the AOE model policy. Understanding that there are a lot of stakeholders and advocacy groups who have concerns about BTA, the AOE engaged in the stakeholder engagement process. You will get a full kind of accounting of that in the legislative report, which I recognize was due 2 days ago and is forthcoming. And much of what's in here is also in that report, so you're getting a preview here. That stakeholder engagement process happened during this fall. The draft model policy was posted, and then there was a public comment process. In that process, a lot of feedback was given that we're working to incorporate into the model policy. So I do acknowledge that the model policy was supposed to be released on December 15th. It should be forthcoming imminently. I would sort of caution, this is work that we're taking really, really seriously. This is the foundation of what becomes all of the BTA work to come. And we're trying to do this in a really thoughtful way. So that is why it's been delayed. But I do want to acknowledge that it is delayed. Flowing from that model policy will be model procedures and best practice and guidelines. So there is a logic to this. It doesn't make sense to do any of that work until we have the model policy. The next step of that work is going to be, as soon as the model policy is released, a review of all of the published BTA materials, resources that currently exist on the School Safety Center to ensure that they have alignment. And then working with schools, get a real understanding of what are the tools that they will really need to be able to implement BTA with fidelity. I'll signal that just as a general comment, everyone in the state is taking this work really, really seriously. We're trying to be deliberative and thoughtful, and we're going to be moving forward in partnership with the school. So as I said, as we are reviewing these materials, as we're identifying what the resources are, we're also going to be engaging every step along the way with our schools to make sure that whatever we put out is useful and implementable as well. We've also been, throughout this process, engaging with the Office of Racial Equity. They've been excellent partners in this work. They've already offered some suggestions on our current BTA training and some adjustments that can be made to it. We've also have real agreement, I think, both at School Safety Center, AOE, and Office of Racial Equity, that BTA is best when it is part of a multi-tiered system of support. And that's going to be our approach, and that it's best when it's treated like a program. So this is not you sign up your BTA team, you do some trainings, you have a policy checkbox done, right? This is an ongoing program of work that needs to have, it's going to have data reporting requirements. There'll be evaluation and analysis of that data. Again, to Chair Collins' point, it will be publicly available information, and that schools will benefit the most from this if it's folded in and brought into the multi-tiered systems of support so that there's coherence to this. We understand one of my goals on the AOE operations team is as much as possible to bring coherence to the various initiatives that our schools are being asked to implement. And this is a place where we think that it makes sense to fold it into MTSS. So there's going to be a lot more work done in that space, and we'll be coordinating with the MTSS team at AOE and within schools as well. So
Not every school implementing MTSS, it should be noted.
yeah, absolutely. And so we'll, yeah.
So just again, working as a school counselor, there's a need to know so that we couldn't share any information with anybody in the school unless we felt they had a need to know. There's due process and parent permission, to speak to a child who's underage. Are those, do those fit into these these practices?
Yes, that was a major consideration of the development of the model policy.
Mhm.
I would let my general counsel to speak to it more carefully, but that was certainly raised by stakeholders, this idea of who needs to know how are records kept, what are the implications and the unintended consequences of that work. And so I would maybe encourage after the model policy is released, maybe having Emily Simmons come in to speak to that. But absolutely, that was certainly a concern and was addressed by that.
Even disclosing a name, of someone, it's very, I don't know, it's just very protected in a school. Not if there's danger, if there's, we suspect, we probably would call the police right away and involve them. But, just as things are kind of possibilities and stuff, just kind of, that's a really gray area for me. And it'd be helpful, I think, for school people to have it pretty clearly defined.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of this development of the model policy and then all of the resources that flow down from that, including model procedures, best practices, that sort of thing. So obviously always FERPA and HIPAA are, baseline, right? You must address those. But I think having this in place, having a BTA program in place will provide some consistency, right, for all schools to understand how should you actually respond in these situations, right?
Mhm.
And that's what BTA is intended to do. It's an assessment activity,
Mhm.
not a law enforcement activity. And I think that's really important to clarify.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent point. So I'm going to keep moving here and sort of signal that there is work being done around the BTA training. We have sort of two different, I would say almost phases of this work, if we want to think about it that way. There's work that needs to be done for current BTA teams to bring them into compliance with the requirements of Act 29. And that work really needs to be completed by the start of the next year. Through the assurance process, we were able to identify that we have roughly 80 current BTA teams. Some are in public, some are in independent schools. And so part of the work of the next several months is going to be ensuring that all of those teams have completed the 1-day, 8-hour BTA training that is currently offered. In addition, and what you all heard yesterday in the Budget Adjustment Act presentation, the AOE is requesting $50,000. That wasn't something we could build into our FY24 budget because, of course, this act was still in process, to offer a 1-day conference, training, workshop, brand it however you like, really targeted to current BTA teams. So by then we'll have the model policy out, we will have the resources developed, asking those teams to come to this conference, identify for them where are the changes, what are things that you need to consider in your current BTA policies and procedures, also offering targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion training that goes with the normal 8-hour BTA training. And in addition, so that will sort of bring our current BTA teams up to speed, up to snuff. We will also be AOE will be releasing a data collection tool for current BTA teams in late spring, early summer of 2024 that meets all of the specific details of Act 29 that are called out and anything else that we think is important. That data will be used, which is helpful. Oftentimes we're collecting data and it's not clear how we're going to be using it. This is not that case. We'll be analyzing the data requirements are, very specifically trying to identify if there may be issues with how BTA teams are potentially identifying students or disproportionately identifying students from marginalized backgrounds or students with disabilities. So that's how that data is going to be analyzed. And then that will then inform very much sort of the phase 2, where we're rolling out BTA for all schools. So we're going to sort of do an iterative, data-driven process there. One other thing that I will call out is that I think that there's real consensus across all of the state agencies here that, as I said, we should really be treating this as a program, and that there's a real need for expertise in this space. And so something that we all collectively should be thinking about is how do we resource for BTA in the future and ongoing. And however that budgeting conversation shakes out, I think it's important that we appropriately resource this for the future so that it's an ongoing program that has analysis, training, potentially a community of practice where BTA teams can bring sort of their incidents and be able to discuss them with peers and also have the expert sort of consultant at the state level to support that work.
Are there states that are sort of ahead of us in this? And how is Vermont, the work that's going on, which is frankly enormous, creating everything from scratch? Or are there models out there that we are able to follow when it comes to the BTA teams?
I can say in general, there are models, but I would actually point to my colleagues, Dee or Sunny, if you want to speak to that, you know more about it than that.
Yes, there are states that are, that have been doing this for many years. I would point specifically to Virginia. They have an incredibly comprehensive, set of legislation. Their equivalent of what our Vermont School Safety Center is built out. This has been ongoing work for a number of years. But there are other states as well. I'm more specifically familiar with Virginia. But yes, we can look at what they've done and use that for guidance. For example, the behavioral threat assessment team training that has been ongoing and is continuing through 2024 is based on the Virginia Guide. That whole model is based on the Virginia Guide, which again was developed through who's basically kind of considered one of the groundworking founders of this model and this policy and this process.
We'll be leveraging that experience, the data from other schools or from other states to understand where the pitfalls might be in improvements. And I think ongoing engagement with our stakeholders here in Vermont is really important, and communication with them throughout the process. As I said, Office of Racial Equity has been an excellent partner and will continue to be as we move forward with that. I think that probably takes us to the last slide, which is the implementation timelines. I've already sort of signaled this. There is a recommendation from the state agencies that the emergency operations plan be given a bit more time so that we can really engage in a planful and thoughtful process. It's easy to sort of fill out the template and say, done and dusted. But I think that we've really seen the value of this work and particularly this collaborative partnerships. And so we don't want to rush that work. Again, you've got the request in the BAA, which I would ask you to support. That will be, I think, really critical to bringing our current BTA teams into compliance with Act 29 and also lay the groundwork for the work that we're going to be doing next year with our other schools.
If you could ask folks at the AOE to provide us with language that you need to extend those timelines, so we can put that into miscellaneous ed bill, that'd be helpful. Yes, please.
So one of the problems I always have with prevention programs is you can't get data because you've prevented the problem, so you can't, sometimes it's hard to justify, funding, prevention programs all over the place because you prevented the issue. And so I'm just wondering, have you thought about how you might measure this, like how you might have prevented or whatever? I mean, I'm just wondering, is that built into kind of the programming? How will we measure?
I can partially answer, and then I'll also ask Dee if you have any comparisons from other states that we could share. So in terms of what we can measure, you're absolutely right. You know, you can't measure the disaster that didn't happen, right? When we will have an annual data collection around BTA. One thing that I would signal that I find really powerful about BTA is that you know, as I said, it's not a law enforcement activity. It does have the potential to engage with law enforcement should there be a real, you know, the assessment determines that there's a real and imminent threat. And that's where you would identify, right, for potentially a prevented situation. But also what BTA can also identify, and I think this is really powerful, is where a student or an adult may just really need immediate supports, right? And so I don't know how we quantify that other than to be able to collect the data on the incidents and what the outcome was of that incident, right? I think that to do a more robust longitudinal kind of study, we would probably need some funding and some data structures for that. And I think that would be a really important thing to engage with. Dee, I don't know, do we have other data from other states or?
There actually is, there's a website, and I couldn't give you the address off the top of my head, but if you Google averted school violent acts, I think, or something along those lines, there is some data, and it's based on publicly accessible data. So it's based on, you know, what, not necessarily reports from schools, but what was publicly available. And they do an analysis and determine, you know, what events were considered averted. And there's parameters they use to develop that. I think that what's important, and what Jill had mentioned, is that this assessment process is a means for identifying students that are going down a certain pathway, and how do we bring them into the fold? How do we bring them into our school communities and provide those support systems, those support networks, and how do we get them onto a better pathway?
Mhm.
So I think, you know, it's not going to be, you know, a number, it's going to be looking at a number, a lot of different pieces of the data that we'll be collecting and being able to analyze that and draw some conclusions.
Great, thank you.
Other questions, committee? Anybody want to make a big generalized statement about how it's too bad that we've reached this point where we're having to devote so much time and energy to this?
I think you just made it.
Sort of think about, you know, I don't want to sound like an old person, but things seem to have been a lot different. You know, I hadn't even thought about, now you have to start coming up with, what's everybody got in place for when every child is outside witnessing the eclipse in Vermont, and anywhere else, you know?
Just the school, you know, the community, the school used to be, people could walk in, you know, and just that hope, losing that is so sad to me.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yes. Great. Thank you very much. And again, just
Thank you.
send us what you need for the timeline extensions. I don't think you'd find any opposition here. They were your deadlines, suggested by AOE. But as you say, this is a kind of big work, needs to be done very thoughtfully, so no problem.
And I think the fact that most of our public schools already have emergency operations commands gives us some confidence that, you know, we're not sort of leaving folks out there with nothing to go from. It's just a matter of how do we do this better with a bit more time. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
So committee, we are back at 1:15 sharp. We'll have healthcare in here with us, probably let them run the show. I might push Representative Toof over a seat to allow the chair of healthcare to take my seat and I'll take his seat.
Looking from the window.
On the